The whistle of the train cut through the brittle air, a low, aching sound that rolled across the snowy fields and stirred the tall, dead grass. Smoke billowed into the leaden sky, curling and twisting like the ghost of summer long gone. On the cracked wooden platform stood two sisters, their dresses tucked into heavy coats, scarves pulled high against the biting wind, their gloved hands gripping letters that had traveled farther than they ever had. Calamity Jane's eyes, gray and sharp as river stones, stayed fixed on the black iron beast approaching, while Molly shifted from foot to foot, the cold creeping through her worn boots. Molly's cheeks were flushed pink from hope or frostbite. Calamity Jane could not tell any more. There was a time when she could read her sister's every thought like pages in a favorite book. Lately, life had made the letters blur. The letters had been a prayer folded into paper, sealed with trembling hands and dreams they were too proud to speak aloud. Mail-order husbands. Strangers who promised safety and salvation in a world that had grown mean and lawless after their father's death. In the eyes of this town, they were already lost women ripe for the picking. Too young, too alone, too stubborn to sell the ranch or surrender. The train screeched and hissed to a halt, shaking loose a fresh shower of snow from the depot's overhang. Steam rolled along the ground like a living thing, swirling between the boots of passengers disembarking. A few townsfolk peered from the windows of the saloon and the general store, curiosity hidden poorly behind twitching curtains. Two men emerged from the fog. The first was tall and striking, a confident smile easing across his lips as he caught sight of the sisters. He wore a long black coat and carried a weathered leather bag, his boots polished despite the mud and snow. His hair was the kind that curled boyishly when damp, and Calamity Jane felt a muscle tighten in her jaw against the charm he wore like a second skin. The second man was broader, moving with a quiet caution, as if the world might crumble if he stepped too hard upon it. His coat was a muted brown, dusted with snow, and a thick scarf hid most of his face. Only his eyes were clearly visible, steady, watchful, framed by lines that spoke of storms already weathered. Molly, bless her tender heart, smiled first. She tucked a loose curl back under her hat and nudged Calamity Jane with her elbow. Calamity Jane forced a breath into her lungs and nodded once, stepping forward. Wade Colton introduced himself with a sweeping bow, his voice warm enough to melt icicles from eaves. Jonas Hale simply tipped his hat, the leather creaking softly in the cold. Formalities were brief, stolen away by the rising howl of the wind. Wade took Molly's offered hand in both of his, speaking low and easy, while Jonas lingered back, his gaze sweeping the empty fields, the dying trees, the faint shimmer of snow that carried secrets across the plains. Calamity Jane watched him, her unease a silent thread winding tighter around her ribs. The ride back to the ranch was a grim march through a world gone white. Horses pulled the wagon over buried ruts, the wheels groaning against the weight of men, supplies, and hope. Calamity Jane held the reins loosely, her fingers stiff inside her gloves, her knuckles pale. Molly talked too much, filling the heavy air with stories about the ranch, about the hard winter they'd survived, about the dreams she still dared to weave aloud. Wade laughed at the right moments, complimented the sisters' spirit, and spoke of big plans and better days. Jonas said little. When he did speak, it was in short, careful words, like a man who had learned that language could wound as easily as knives. The ranch loomed into view at last, battered but still standing. Smoke rose from the chimney, stubborn and thin. Calamity Jane felt the familiar ache rise in her chest, grief braided with pride, and wondered if these men could see how much it had cost to keep this place alive. Molly jumped down first, cheeks flushed with excitement, and began showing Wade the stables, the chicken coop, the grove of frostbitten apple trees. Wade followed, his voice carrying easily over the snow, promising repairs, prosperity, and safety. Calamity Jane dismounted slowly. She found Jonas waiting beside the wagon, gloved hands tucked deep in his coat pockets. He said nothing, but his eyes traveled over the ranch, noting every sagging beam, every broken fence rail, every small defiance against decay. He nodded once, a gesture of quiet respect. Calamity Jane felt it strike her harder than all Wade's grand promises. Inside the house, the wood stove fought a losing battle against the cold. Wade set about making himself at home, shrugging off his coat and talking of ideas for expansion. Jonas hung back by the door, stamping the snow from his boots without a word. Night fell fast, swallowing the fields in blackness. The storm strengthened, rattling the shutters and sifting snow through cracks in the window frames. Over a meager supper, plans were made. Wade talked of building a new barn, of selling a few head of cattle to ease the debt, of taking a firm hand with the local Cowboys. His confidence filled the room like smoke, heady, blinding. Molly glowed under his attention, her laughter soft and nervous. Calamity Jane forced herself to smile, to nod, to ignore the small, persistent warning curling low in her gut. Jonas spoke little, but when he did, it was to ask about practical things. The condition of the well, the number of working horses, the nearest neighbor. Questions a man asked if he meant to stay. After the meal, Calamity Jane excused herself and wrapped a shawl tightly around her shoulders. She stepped outside, the cold hitting her like a slap. Above, the sky churned with heavy clouds, hiding the stars. The snow fell thicker now, covering the wagon tracks, the footprints, the uncertain path ahead. Behind her, she heard the door creak open. Jonas's boots crunched softly over the porch boards. He did not speak, only stood beside her, gazing out into the white expanse. In the silence between them, something shifted. Not trust. Not yet. But a small, aching sense that here was a man who knew how to stand still without needing to be seen, who understood that sometimes the hardest battles were fought in silence. Calamity Jane tightened her shawl against the wind. Tomorrow would bring answers for better or worse. Tonight, the snow would keep their secrets safe, buried deep beneath the drifts. And somewhere in that frozen world, the promises written in desperate letters would either bloom into salvation, or shatter into ash. The storm settled in by morning, thick and merciless, blanketing the world in a cold so heavy it bowed the pine branches low and erased the horizon in a single sweep of white. Inside the house, the walls groaned with each gust of wind, and the windows wept cold tears of condensation. The sisters and their guests huddled close to the stove, where the fire crackled weakly, a fragile heart beating against the storm's endless howl. Calamity Jane moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, chopping roots, stirring porridge, mending a tear in the worn curtain. She listened without appearing to listen, her ears tuned to the conversations unraveling in the cramped room. Wade talked easily, his voice warm and sure, spinning tales of towns he had traveled through, businesses he had started, the fortunes he had won and lost with little more than a wink and a quick hand. Molly hung on every word, her eyes wide, her lips parted in a soft, admiring smile. She deserved to believe, Calamity Jane thought bitterly, deserved something that looked like a future. Jonas, by contrast, spoke rarely, and when he did, it was with the quiet certainty of a man who weighed each word like gold dust. He spent the morning mending a broken hinge on the barn door, fashioning a new latch from salvaged iron without being asked. His hands were steady, capable, the hands of a man who did not need to announce his worth. By midday, the snow was so thick it blurred the world into a ghost town. The wind hammered at the house like a drunkard demanding entry. Wade grew restless, pacing from window to window, muttering about missed opportunities, about the ranch's potential if only certain sacrifices were made. Calamity Jane caught him studying the old deed that hung framed above the fireplace, his gaze calculating, hungry. When he noticed her watching, he smiled, a flash of teeth too fast, too bright, and spoke of prosperity, of new beginnings. His words hung in the air like frost. After supper, the town's only lawman, Sheriff Cole Anders, came knocking, his coat powdered white, his mustache rimed with ice. He shook off the snow like a bear and stamped into the kitchen, steam rising from his shoulders. He had a way of talking that made a man feel guilty just for breathing. He stayed long enough to accept a mug of coffee, to cast a long, measuring look at Wade, and to warn of a group of rough cowboys seen lingering near the eastern trail. Men without loyalty or patience, desperate as wolves with empty bellies. When the sheriff left, Wade made light of it, laughing too loud, slapping Jonas on the back and boasting that any troublemakers would find themselves on the wrong end of a bullet. Molly laughed along too quickly, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. Calamity Jane said nothing. She watched Jonas instead. His face remained unreadable, but something in the way he checked the locks that night, the way he placed the rifle within easy reach of the front door, told her he believed danger was closer than the blizzard's edge. That night the storm deepened. It prowled the edges of the house, a living thing with ice in its breath. In the darkness, Calamity Jane lay awake listening to every creak, every groan of the timbers, every soft shift of footsteps. Somewhere near midnight, Molly's soft voice drifted through the darkness, whispering plans, dreams, foolish hopes that Wade encouraged with practiced charm. Calamity Jane turned her face into her pillow and bit back the ache that rose unbidden in her throat. She did not want to be the enemy of her sister's happiness. But there were things a woman knew without proof, truths etched into the bones by the hard schooling of life. Near dawn, Calamity Jane rose and wrapped herself in her father's old coat. She moved to the window, scraping away the frost with her sleeve. Through the swirling snow, she caught a shadow slipping away from the barn, leading a saddled horse. It was Wade. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs as she watched him ride out into the storm, the horse's hooves muffled by the heavy drifts. Where would he go in such deadly cold unless he had something too urgent, or too dangerous, to delay? Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Jonas stood in the doorway, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his gaze following hers into the white oblivion. He said nothing, only met her eyes with a look that carried more weight than words could bear. They both understood something had shifted. Something had cracked open beneath the heavy hush of snow, and whatever lay beneath would not stay buried for long. The morning wore on slow as molasses in January. Wade returned, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, his smile too sharp, too bright. He brushed off questions with laughter and grand tales of checking the livestock, ensuring the barns were secure. Calamity Jane watched Molly cling to those lies like a drowning girl clings to driftwood. Jonas spent the day repairing the roof where ice had split the shingles. He worked silently, methodically, the storm swirling around him. From the window, Calamity Jane watched him drive nails into wood, his movements steady despite the biting cold. He was a man who built things to last, not for show. At dusk, Miss Evelyn Marsh appeared at the door, wrapped in so many shawls she looked like a walking bundle of laundry. She brought a basket of preserves and a warning whispered behind a tight-lipped smile. Folks talked, she said. Folks remembered a Wade Colton who'd left debts and broken promises in 3 towns before this one. When Evelyn left, her footprints were swallowed almost immediately by the hungry snow. That evening, Calamity Jane confronted Wade. She did not accuse, only asked careful questions, questions that any honest man could answer without flinching. Wade answered too smoothly, his charm turning brittle under pressure. Molly grew upset, accusing Calamity Jane of jealousy, of coldness, of trying to snatch away her chance at happiness. Her tears cut deeper than any blade. Jonas stayed silent through it all, watching with those steady eyes, waiting. His presence was not a weapon, but a shield quietly offered. Later, when the house was asleep, Calamity Jane found Jonas outside, sitting on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The snow drifted high against the posts, the world wrapped in silent white shrouds. She sat beside him without speaking. After a long while, he spoke in a voice low and rough from disuse. A man doesn't run out into a storm unless he's running from something worse behind him. Calamity Jane closed her eyes against the truth she had known all along. She was tired of men who smiled and lied and left wreckage behind them. Tired of being the only one willing to see the cracks in the foundation before the house came down. Jonas shifted slightly, reaching into his coat and pulling out a small object. He placed it in her gloved hand without ceremony. It was a carving, rough but tender, of a sparrow. A symbol of hope, small but stubborn, surviving against the odds. She closed her fingers around it tightly, feeling the warmth of his touch linger. Above them, the stars had returned, brittle and cold in the clear black sky. The storm had passed, but the real trouble was just beginning. Inside the house, Wade plotted. Outside, the land lay still, listening. And somewhere between the two, Calamity Jane found herself choosing not between two men, but between the easy lies of survival and the harder, quieter road of trust earned inch by inch in the frozen dark. Morning rose brittle and sharp, the kind of morning that cut through even the thickest coats and scraped its cold fingers down into the bones. The world outside lay frozen and clean, hiding yesterday's footprints, yesterday's sins, under a flawless blanket of snow. But inside the house, the air was thick with something that no storm could bury. Molly hummed as she swept the kitchen, trying too hard to summon normalcy into the brittle daylight. Wade sat by the fire, oiling his gun, his movements quick and smooth. He caught Calamity Jane watching him and offered a grin that did not touch his eyes. Jonas returned from his early rounds, his boots heavy with ice, his scarf pulled high against the wind. He set his rifle down carefully by the door. His gaze sweeping the room once, reading every small tension like words carved into wood. Over a breakfast of stale biscuits and bitter coffee, Wade announced his plan. The ranch was too much for the sisters, he said. Better to sell half the cattle now, buy supplies, invest in a partnership with men he knew from town. Men who could offer protection, expansion, opportunity. Molly's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her brow furrowed, uncertainty flickering through her features. Calamity Jane kept her voice even as she asked who these men were. Wade's answers were slick, oily, wrapped in grand promises and easy laughter. Jonas said nothing, but he rose from the table and stepped outside, his silence louder than any shouted argument. By midday the truth began to unravel. Miss Evelyn returned, breathless and wide-eyed, a telegram clutched in her mittened hand. Jonas had sent it days ago, Calamity Jane learned later, reaching out to a friend in a distant town where Wade Colton's name had already been burned into ledger books and whispered behind closed doors. The telegram spoke plainly. Wade was no rancher, no businessman. He was a gambler, a drifter, a man who left towns worse off than he found them, always moving just ahead of the debts he piled like fallen snowdrifts. When confronted, Wade laughed at first, a rich, mocking sound that filled the small house and rattled in Calamity Jane's chest like loose stones. He spun tales of misunderstanding, of jealous rivals, of second chances. He turned his charm toward Molly, pleading, weaving bright illusions faster than frost forming on glass. Molly's face crumpled as the weight of his lies settled heavy on her slender shoulders. She backed away, bumping into the corner of the table, her eyes searching Wade's face for some scrap of the man she had wanted so desperately to believe in. Calamity Jane stood firm, her father's old rifle gripped steady in her hands. She did not raise it. She did not have to. Sometimes strength lived not in the threat of violence but in the simple refusal to move. Wade's grin slipped at last. His mask, so carefully held, cracked wide open. Beneath it, there was only a small, mean man who had gambled on the desperation of lonely women and lost. He spat a curse under his breath and slammed out of the house, the door banging against the frame like a gunshot. The silence he left behind was colder than the storm. Jonas stepped from the shadows then, as if he had been waiting, not to interfere but to bear silent witness. He walked to the door, picked up the rifle Wade had left behind, checked it with the mechanical precision of long habit, and placed it high on the mantel out of harm's reach. Molly wept that night, not loudly but in the soft, broken way that tore through walls and settled deep into the heart. Calamity Jane held her until the trembling stopped, brushing the damp hair from her sister's forehead with hands too clumsy to soothe but too stubborn to let go. Jonas waited by the porch, silent and still, guarding without being asked. In the days that followed, the snow began to thaw, dripping from the eaves in slow, rhythmic tears. Life resumed its steady, stubborn pace. The sisters mended fences, hauled water, fed cattle. Jonas helped without fanfare, repairing what needed fixing, his presence as steady as the mountain's own shadow. He asked for nothing. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields and the trees stood black against the melting snow, Calamity Jane found Jonas sitting on the back steps, whittling a piece of wood into something small and delicate. She sat beside him, the roughness of the wood against her skirts, the smell of cut pine sweet and sharp in the cooling air. He handed her the carving without ceremony. Another sparrow, smaller than the first, wings stretched as if caught in the act of taking flight. She turned it over in her palm, feeling the tiny imperfections, the fingerprints of his care pressed into every curve. He spoke then, voice low and sure. A broken wing still flies if it's set right. It was not a confession, not a proposal, not a promise. It was a truth laid bare between them, as clean and sharp as the winter air. She met his gaze, and for the first time she did not flinch from the depth she found there. Not pity. Not rescue. Simply recognition. Inside the house, Molly sang softly as she kneaded bread, her voice still cracked in places but growing stronger with each note. The storm had stripped them down to their rawest selves, but it had also left behind something fierce and clean and unbreakable. Trust, built not on promises or grand gestures, but on quiet endurance. Calamity Jane closed her fingers around the sparrow and let herself believe, just a little, that spring might come after all. The horizon still wore its coat of ice and shadow, but somewhere beyond it, seeds waited under the snow, stubborn and sure, biding their time. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, its own reckonings. But tonight, as the stars blinked awake and the wind softened to a whisper, the masks lay scattered and forgotten, and the truth, raw, hard and shining, was enough. The day dawned slow and pale, as if the sun itself was unsure whether it was safe to rise. A thin crust of ice covered the earth, glittering under the timid light like the world had been remade in glass. Breath rose in soft plumes from every mouth, from the cattle in the pens to the horses shifting restlessly in the barn. The ranch, battered but standing, seemed to hold its breath along with its inhabitants. Calamity Jane woke to a feeling she could not name, a tension stretched tight across her ribs. The storm inside had not ended, not truly. It had only shifted, settling deeper into the ground, waiting. Over breakfast, Jonas spoke in low tones with Sheriff Cole Anders, who had ridden out early, his horse sweating despite the cold. Trouble was coming, he said. Trouble wearing worn boots and empty holsters, carrying grudges sharpened by whiskey and desperation. Wade had not gone far. He had traded stories in town, stirred up old debts, promised desperate men their share of the ranch if they helped him reclaim it. Men like that needed little reason to spill blood. The sisters prepared in silence. Molly tightened the bolts on the shutters. Calamity Jane counted the few rounds they had left, her hand steady now, the old fear burnt down to hard, bright coal inside her. Jonas checked the rifle, the pistol, the spare ammunition tucked into the flour bin. He moved with the easy calm of a man who had seen worse days and survived them, not untouched, but unbroken. When they came not with the roar of thunder but with the stealth of wolves. 6 men bundled against the cold, faces hidden beneath scarves and hats. Wade rode among them, hat pulled low, rifle across his lap. His grin was the same, bright and hollow as a broken window. They stopped at the edge of the property, horses stamping in the snow, waiting. Calamity Jane stood on the porch, Jonas beside her, Molly just behind, clutching the old shotgun like a lifeline. Wade called out first, voice smooth as pond ice, offering a chance to walk away, to sell, to live. Calamity Jane stepped forward, boots crunching over the frozen boards, the wind tugging at her coat like a warning. No, it was not a shout. It did not need to be. The first shot cracked the stillness like a whip. Chaos erupted, wild and clumsy, men shouting, horses screaming, gunfire splitting the brittle air. Jonas pulled Calamity Jane back against the doorframe, returning fire with cold precision. Sheriff Anders, hidden in the barn with his deputy, opened up with a long rifle, dropping one of Wade's men in a spray of red against the snow. Wade's face twisted in rage as he spurred his horse forward, aiming straight for the porch. Calamity Jane raised her father's rifle, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the world. She fired once, the recoil punching into her shoulder. Wade's horse reared, throwing him into the snow where he lay gasping, clutching his leg. The others faltered. Men who came for easy spoils had little stomach for a real fight. Within minutes, it was over, the air thick with smoke and the sharp copper tang of blood. Jonas moved among the fallen with grim efficiency, kicking away weapons, binding wounds where mercy demanded it. Calamity Jane knelt beside Molly, who sat dazed on the steps, her hands still clenched around the shotgun. It was Sheriff Anders who hauled Wade upright, slapping irons on his wrists with a satisfaction he did not bother to hide. Wade's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he spat into the snow, hatred burning in his eyes. Jonas turned away from him without a word, offering his hand to Calamity Jane instead. She took it. The town came slowly, cautiously, to see what had become of the storm. Neighbors arrived with pies and preserves, with offers of labor, with hands extended not in pity, but in respect. Word spread fast. The ranch had been defended not just by gunfire but by grit, by stubbornness, by a refusal to be broken. Weeks passed. The snow began to recede, dripping away from fence posts, unveiling the muddy scars of winter. Seeds were planted. Fences rebuilt. Life, stubborn and sweet, pushed through the frost-bitten ground. Molly laughed more often now, her voice stronger, her step lighter. She spoke sometimes of taking in orphans from the east, of filling the house with voices and hope. Jonas remained. Not with grand speeches or solemn vows, but in the quiet way he mended the porch rail, in the steady hand he offered when the roof needed patching, in the simple, patient way he looked at Calamity Jane as if she were not broken, not hard, but whole and shining in ways the world had never deserved. On a warm evening when the stars hung heavy and low, Calamity Jane found herself beside Jonas once more, their hands brushing as they leaned on the fence, watching the cattle graze in the dusk. No promises were made. None were needed. Their bond was not built on the easy language of lovers, but on something older, something forged in the white heat of survival and cooled slowly, patiently, into steel. The storm had ended. Not because it had blown itself out, but because they had endured it together, had dug in their heels and refused to be moved. In the years to come, they would tell stories about that winter, about the sisters who fought for their land, about the quiet man who stood like a wall beside them, about the cowboy who thought he could own what was never his to claim. And maybe, somewhere in the retelling they would forget the fear, the hunger, the long nights of wondering if hope was foolish. But Calamity Jane would remember. She would remember that strength was not loud. It was not cruel. It was the quiet voice that said, yes, I will stay. Yes, I will fight. Yes, I see you, and you are enough. And in the fading light, with the fields stretching wide and green before them, she knew that some storms came not to destroy, but to reveal the things worth saving. The stagecoach creaked and moaned as it rattled over the last stretch of hard earth, the wheels cutting long scars into the dust. Evening leaned heavy against the sky, washing the prairie in shades of faded gold and quiet blue. When the coach groaned to a stop at the town's edge, no one rushed to greet it. Only the wind stirred, lifting little whirls of dust that danced like restless ghosts around the wheels. She stepped down, small boots hitting the earth with a soft thud. A girl wrapped in a faded shawl, her dress simple, her hands calloused but careful as they clutched a satchel to her chest. Around her neck, half hidden beneath the modest collar, glinted a small silver cross, catching the last breath of sunlight like a spark desperate to stay lit. Her name was Laura Bullion. She had come across 2 territories and half a dream to be here, riding on the hope written in a letter by a man she had never met but who had promised her a place, a home, maybe even a hand to hold when the nights turned cold. The cross at her throat had belonged to her mother once, a memory strung on a thin chain, worn smooth by years of prayer and grief. It was all she had left from a world that had offered her little but hardship and taught her that kindness, like rain in a drought, was rare and fleeting. The town stretched before her, a haphazard scattering of wooden buildings crouched low against the plains as if afraid the sky might crush them. A saloon leaned tiredly against a mercantile, and across the way, a church stood thin and stoic, its bell silent, its steeple pointing toward heaven like a question no one dared ask aloud. From the porch of the general store, men watched her descend, hats pulled low, boots tapping a slow, suspicious rhythm against the boards. Behind the grimy window of the saloon, a few faces peered out, curiosity mingling with something sharper, something that cut like broken glass under bare feet. Then he came, the man who had sent the letter. Walter Griggs was bigger than she expected, a barrel-chested man with hands like hams and eyes too small for his face. His boots thudded heavily on the ground as he approached, a grimace already carving itself into his features. He looked her up and down with all the warmth of a butcher selecting a lamb for slaughter. "You," he said, voice rough as gravel. "You're the girl?" Laura Bullion lifted her chin, forced her voice to stay steady though her heart knocked hard against her ribs. "I am," she said. "Laura Bullion. I came from Kansas City. I have your letter." She fumbled the folded paper from her pocket, held it out like a peace offering. Griggs didn't take it. His gaze instead caught on the silver cross at her throat. His face twisted, something mean flickering behind his eyes. "You ain't what was promised," he said loud enough that heads turned. "They said you was proper." Laura Bullion's fingers brushed instinctively against the cross, feeling the familiar ridges of it beneath her touch. "I am proper," she whispered, but the words tasted hollow, a prayer lost in a storm. Griggs spat in the dust at her feet. "Not with that thing hangin' off you like some cursed metal. I ain't talking no papist girl into my house. What kind of luck you think that brings?" The words hit harder than fists. She tried to explain, it wasn't about the church, not really, it was about her mother, about memory, about holding on to something when the world kept taking everything else, but no one wanted to hear. In that moment, the cross wasn't a symbol of faith or love. It was a noose the townfolk tightened with their stares. Griggs turned and walked away, his boots throwing up little clouds of dust. A laugh rose from the saloon, sharp and mean. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. Laura Bullion stood frozen, the stagecoach creaking behind her, the town folding itself back into indifference. No one stepped forward. No one offered a hand. The driver of the coach shrugged apologetically, climbed back up onto the box, and with a slap of reins and a whistle, the vehicle pulled away, leaving her standing in the rising dusk like a gravestone no one came to visit. Her knees wanted to buckle but she didn't let them. Instead, she gathered what was left of her pride, set her shoulders, and walked toward the small inn that sagged at the far end of the street. Her boots raised little puffs of dust with each step, and the cross at her throat swung lightly, catching the dimming light, refusing to be hidden. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a tobacco-stained grin, quoted a price she couldn't pay. Laura Bullion counted her coins with trembling fingers and realized she didn't have enough for a room, barely enough for bread. The man shrugged, pointed to a bench outside. "You're welcome to the porch," he said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "Better in the street." She nodded, murmured her thanks and sank onto the bench, the wood pressing cold and splintered against her spine. The sky deepened from gold to bruised purple, and one by one, stars blinked awake overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a fiddle sang a sad tune. Laura Bullion hugged her satchel tight, tucked her feet beneath her skirt, and laid her head against the wall. She wept silently, the kind of weeping that has no sound because it runs too deep, an ache that water cannot cure. She cried for the mother who wasn't here, for the miles of lonely road behind her, for the promise broken before it could even be held. When the cold crept in, she fingered the cross again as she had so many nights before, and whispered the old prayers her mother had taught her. Words about mercy, about being seen, about surviving when the world turned its face away. The wind picked up, sighing through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and far-off rain. And somewhere, hidden in the long shadows, a pair of eyes watched her. Eyes that didn't judge. Eyes that saw the girl, not the cross, not the rumors, not the worn dress or the tear-streaked face, but the fierce, trembling heart still beating against all odds. The bench creaked as she shifted, pulling the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't know it yet, but she had already been seen. Not as a burden. Not as a mistake. But as something rare, a flower still blooming stubbornly in the hard-baked soil, roots deeper than the drought could reach. The stars wheeled overhead, quiet and constant, and in their ancient language they whispered the truth of it. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Morning came slow and gray, stretching thin light across the uneven boards of the inn's porch. Laura Bullion blinked herself awake, stiff and chilled, her shawl barely warding off the creeping cold. The town yawned to life around her, shutters creaking open, boots thudding down steps, voices already rough and businesslike. No one spared a glance her way. She rose, brushing the dust from her skirts, and lifted her chin. Pride was a strange thing, heavy and hollow, but it was all she had left to wear. The baker's shop was the first place she tried. Its windows steamed with the promise of bread and coffee, and Laura Bullion's stomach pinched tight with longing. Inside she offered her services, cleaning, scrubbing, anything honest, but the woman behind the counter, plump and pink-faced, barely concealed her sneer. Her eyes flicked to the cross swinging gently at Laura Bullion's throat, and her mouth pressed thin. "Already got help," she said. Though Laura Bullion saw no one else there. The door shut harder than necessary behind her. At the dressmaker's, at the livery, at the boarding house, it was the same. Smiles that slipped off faces like oil on water the moment they saw her, conversations that ended mid-sentence, hands waving her away as if she carried some sickness in her blood. The cross burned cold against her skin, a reminder, a burden, a brand. At noon, she sat on the low stone wall that bordered the mercantile and picked at the crust of a biscuit she had bought with the last of her coins. Children played in the street, their laughter bright and careless. A group of women passed by, skirts rustling like dry leaves. Laura Bullion caught scraps of their conversation, the words cross and cursed floating sharp and unkind on the wind. She pressed the silver charm into her palm until it left a dent against her skin. There were kindnesses, small and scattered like wild seeds. Mrs. Porter, the widow who ran the town's library, paused in her slow, careful walk to offer a wrapped bundle, a heel of bread and a soft-boiled egg, and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Some folks don't remember what it's like to be a stranger," she said, voice as creaky as her knees. "You hold on, child. Good soil's deep down. Just gotta plant your feet and wait." Laura Bullion thanked her with a voice that wobbled and tucked the bundle into her satchel like treasure. Later, as the sun sagged low and the town began to drink itself into evening, she found herself wandering to the edge of town where the land opened up wide and wild. There, on a small hill, sat a tiny chapel, its white paint peeling like sunburned skin, its windows clouded by years of dust. A cross stood crooked above the door, simple and worn. She stepped inside, her boots scuffing soft against the wooden floor. It smelled of old wood and older prayers. No one was there. Only silence and motes of dust hanging heavy in the air like suspended breath. Laura Bullion knelt at the rough pew and let herself break, not loud, not violent, but slow and aching. She prayed without words, her hands clutching the cross at her throat, her heart offering up all the loneliness and shame it could carry. When she rose, her eyes were clearer, her spine straighter. Outside, the horizon burned with the last fire of day, painting the prairie in molten golds and deepening blues. She stood a long moment, watching the sky swallow the sun, and promised herself she would not leave. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain there was nothing left here worth fighting for. Down the main street, Nathan Hale watched her from the shadows. He leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon, hat pulled low, nursing a mug he hadn't drunk from in an hour. He had seen her arrive, seen Griggs turn from her with a face full of small cruelty, seen the way she held herself against the stairs like a soldier on a battlefield. Nathan had known many kinds of strength, the loud, boastful kind that swaggered through the saloon doors, and the quiet kind that built fences in the rain and buried loved ones with steady hands. Laura Bullion wore the latter like a second skin. He hadn't spoken to her yet. Didn't know what words would matter or if any would. But he watched. 2 days later, Laura Bullion found work. Mrs. Porter needed help sorting the books in the library, dusty, crooked shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten knowledge. Laura Bullion worked without complaint, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pulled back, fingers smudged with dust and ink. She found small joy there among the books, stories that didn't care about crosses or whispered judgments, worlds where girls like her could be queens or heroes or saints. Sometimes the town's children wandered in. One afternoon, as a storm brewed heavy and green over the plains, little Sadie Lynn, no more than 6 years old, with a tangle of blonde hair and a gap-toothed grin, tiptoed up to Laura Bullion and thrust a crumpled wildflower into her hand. "For you," she said shyly before darting away. Laura Bullion pressed the flower between the pages of a worn Bible, letting the petals dry and flatten like a pressed piece of hope. The storm broke that night, wild and sudden. Rain slammed against the inn's roof, lightning slashed open the sky, and thunder shook the bones of the town. Laura Bullion huddled beneath the thin blanket the innkeeper had finally loaned her and listened to the world tear itself apart. In the morning, the streets were rivers of mud, wagons stuck up to their axles, chickens squawking indignantly from rooftops. Men cursed and women shook out sodden rugs, and the whole town smelled of wet wood and bruised earth. Laura Bullion helped where she could. She hauled sandbags for the church, mopped the mercantile's flooded floor, soothed a frightened colt trapped in a half-collapsed stable. Still, most folks only muttered their thanks and avoided her gaze. Some even crossed themselves when she passed, as if her cross might leap from her throat and curse them where they stood. Nathan Hale watched. And thought. He watched the way she set her shoulders and worked harder when rebuffed. Watched the way she knelt in the mud to pull a sobbing child free from a stuck cartwheel. Watched the way she pressed a hand to her cross not in shame, but in silent defiance, in memory of something precious and pure. The town might have turned its back on her. But Nathan saw her. He saw the stubborn dignity threaded through her like the veins of iron that laced the mountains beyond the town. He saw the loneliness tucked into the corners of her smile, the kindness she poured into a world that offered her little in return. And deep in the marrow of him, something shifted. Quietly, like a seed cracking open in the dark, ready to reach for light. Laura Bullion, for her part, noticed the quiet rancher too. She noticed the way he tipped his hat when he passed her, a gesture no one else bothered to spare. She noticed the way he stayed back during the storm, helping others with a calm steadiness, never raising his voice, never asking for thanks. She noticed the way he spoke little but said much with the way he looked at people, as if weighing their hearts rather than their appearances. It was not love that stirred between them yet. It was something older, quieter, and perhaps stronger, recognition. On the third evening after the storm, as the sun dipped low and painted the puddles gold, Laura Bullion found a basket resting on the inn's porch. Inside were 2 loaves of bread, a jar of honey, a bundle of candles, and a folded note tucked between them. No signature. Just 5 words written in a firm, steady hand. For when the cold sets in. Laura Bullion stood there a long time, the basket cradled against her hip, the cross warm against her skin, the note trembling in her fingers. She lifted her face to the sky, felt the cool kiss of the breeze against her cheeks, and for the first time in a long while she smiled. Small, uncertain but real. Somewhere nearby, Nathan Hale tipped his hat and rode away into the deepening twilight, leaving only hoofprints and possibilities behind. The town might have turned its back. But maybe, just maybe, not everyone had. The days lengthened, stretching like soft taffy under the slow warming of the prairie sun. Spring hinted at itself in the tender green shoots poking stubbornly through the battered earth. Laura Bullion moved through the town like a spirit now, seen but not touched, whispered about but rarely spoken to. She took small cleaning jobs where she could, mended torn seams, wiped dust from cracked church pews, swept the floors of places that would not give her shelter but didn't mind her hands if they worked quietly enough. She asked for nothing but the dignity of honest labor, and even that sometimes felt like too much to hope for. Still she stayed. Because hope, once lit, is a hard thing to snuff out. And because sometimes a soul, having been turned away too often, roots itself not from stubbornness but survival. Nathan Hale saw her in the mornings, sweeping the boards outside the mercantile before the owner rose from sleep. He saw her patching Mrs. Porter's roof when no man in town had offered help, balancing precariously with a hammer too large for her hand but a resolve too large for her slight frame. He saw the way she would crouch to speak to Sadie Lynn, listening with her whole face, as if the words of a 6-year-old were a scripture she was honored to hear. Nathan was not a man who rushed at things. Not horses, not storms, not people. He had learned young that some things, the best things, needed time to trust to reveal their worth like a river carves a canyon one patient year at a time. And so he watched. And waited. Until the day came when waiting was no longer enough. It was a Thursday when the ranch hands at the Broken Spur began to mutter about needing help with the spring lambing. Laura Bullion heard of it secondhand, in whispers while she scrubbed the church steps. She wiped her hands on her skirt and approached the foreman herself, asked if they might need someone for cleaning, cooking, tending the new foals. The foreman barked a laugh in her face, a cruel noise that startled the sparrows from the rafters. "Don't need no cursed girl near the stock," he said, loud enough that the men around him chuckled, mean and hollow. "Bad luck's worse than wolves this time of year." Laura Bullion bowed her head, swallowed the stone of shame that lodged in her throat, and walked away. It was Nathan who found her near the well, hands clutched tight around the wooden crank, body trembling with the effort to hold in tears. He didn't speak right away. Just stood a few feet off, letting his presence be enough. Not forcing, not demanding. Just waiting. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were dry but full of the kind of hurt that did not need water to wound. "I ain't a skin for pity," she said, voice low, raw. "I know," Nathan said simply. They stood like that for a long breath of a moment, the breeze tugging at her skirt, at the loose strands of hair that framed her tired face. In the distance, the fields rippled in soft green waves, and somewhere a hawk wheeled lazy circles against the wide-open blue. Nathan cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "Could use help at my place," he said. "Nothing fancy. Chickens need tend in. Garden could use a hand." Laura Bullion studied him, wary. "Not charity," he added, voice steady. "Pays fair. Works honest." And something in the way he said it, quiet, offering but not pleading, made her nod. She followed him back to the edge of town where the land spread out like a story waiting to be written. The ranch house small but sturdy, the fences neat, the barn solid against the pressing sky. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't grandeur. But it was a life built board by board, seed by seed, honest and whole. The work was hard, but Laura Bullion took to it like a seed to soil. She mucked stalls, fed the chickens, patched fence lines alongside Nathan. They spoke little at first, but it was a comfortable silence, like the hush that falls between verses of a well-loved hymn. Over time, words bloomed slowly between them, small, hesitant at first, then stronger. Nathan told her about his sister, Leah, gone to fever 2 winters past, and how he still left her room untouched because some memories were too sacred to disturb. Laura Bullion in turn told him about her mother, about the mornings spent bent over mending baskets just to buy a day's worth of bread, about the lullabies sung by firelight when the world outside felt too cruel to bear. She told him about the cross. "My mama gave it to me," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed itself out across the horizon. Said it was a reminder. Not of sermons or saints, but of love. Of carrying each other when we can't walk alone. Nathan didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, and in his gaze there was no pity, no judgment. Only understanding. Only the kind of knowing that comes from carrying heavy things alone for too long. The silence stretched warm between them, thick with things that didn't need saying. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough-edged. "Seems to me," he said, "the world could use more folks who remember to carry others." After that night something shifted. Not fast, not dramatic, but slow and sure, like the turning of a river's course. Nathan began leaving small offerings where she would find them. A sprig of lavender tied with twine on the kitchen table, a smooth river stone left on the fence post, a jar of wild honey set on the windowsill. Laura Bullion, in return, mended his shirts with careful stitches, baked his bread with extra care, planted marigolds by the doorstep to ward off bad spirits, though she knew it was not superstition she was fighting but loneliness. One evening, a sudden storm rolled in off the plains, wild and fierce. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing shingles from roofs and uprooting the garden Laura Bullion had so carefully tended. She ran into the storm without thinking, battling the elements to save what she could, wrestling tarps over the henhouse, chasing loose boards across the yard. When Nathan found her, she was knee-deep in mud, hair plastered to her face, hands raw and bleeding. He didn't scold. He didn't shout. He just grabbed her hand, pulled her close, and together they fought the storm, side by side, breath by breath. When at last the winds died and the rain slowed to a sullen drizzle, they stood panting in the wreckage, soaked to the bone, caked in mud, laughing breathless. Wild laughter born from relief and stubbornness and the strange, defiant joy of survival. Nathan cupped her face in his hands then, gentle as the first kiss of spring on winter-worn earth. "You're something fierce," he whispered, almost in awe. Laura Bullion smiled through the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Just stubborn," she said. But Nathan shook his head, slow and sure. "No," he said. "You're brave." It wasn't a Delora Bullionchen. It wasn't a confession. It was simply truth, offered without demand, received without fear. That night, Laura Bullion sat by the fire, wrapped in a dry quilt, sipping broth Nathan had made with his own calloused hands. The warmth seeped into her bones, into the hollow spaces grief had carved, filling them not with grand promises but with the quiet, steady certainty that here, in this battered house, on this battered land, she was seen. Not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as something rare, something worth saving, something worth standing beside when the storms came howling. Outside, the world dripped and shivered under a sky slowly clearing to stars. Inside, by the crackling fire, Laura Bullion touched the cross at her throat, feeling its familiar weight against her skin, but for the first time in a long while, it felt lighter. Because some burdens shared lose their heaviness. And some hearts, once broken, find new ways to beat again, not despite the cracks but because of them. Nathan sat across from her, fixing a broken boot with slow, methodical care, the firelight catching the gold in his hair, the quiet strength in his hands. Laura Bullion watched him, heart swelling with something too vast for words. Hope perhaps. Or maybe love. But not the kind that burns hot and fast and leaves ashes in its wake. No, this was the kind of love that rooted deep, twined around broken places, grew steady and slow like ivy on an old stone wall. The kind that stayed. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Nathan looked up and caught her gaze. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In the hush between them, in the crackle of the flames and the soft sigh of the wind against the windows, a promise bloomed, fragile, fierce, and unspoken. They would carry each other. And it would be enough. The days that followed carried a strange, golden hush, like the prairie itself was holding its breath. The storm had stripped the land bare, battered it raw, but in its aftermath, everything felt sharper, cleaner, more honest. Shoots of green pierced the broken soil, wild and stubborn, and in the mornings, the world smelled of wet earth and promise. Laura Bullion rose with the sun now, working alongside Nathan without needing to speak what had already been understood between them. Side by side, they mended fences, replanted gardens, coaxed life back into the wounded land. She wore his old work gloves, the fingers too big, and he sometimes carried a wildflower tucked behind one ear, a silent, boyish kind of offering he never spoke of. The townspeople watched, of course. Small towns always watch. Some shook their heads at the sight of her, the girl they had turned their backs on, now standing straight and unashamed beside a man they all respected but never truly understood. Others muttered darker things, blaming the storms, the poor harvest, the unexpected deaths of livestock on the girl who dared wear a cross around her neck like a battle flag. But there were quieter voices too. Mrs. Porter leaving fresh eggs on the porch without a word. Sadie Lynn dragging her little brother up the dirt path just to wave at Laura Bullion from the fence line. The preacher's wife nodding stiffly as she passed, a silent truce offered in the nod. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was enough to keep breathing for. It was a Wednesday when the last stone was laid on the new corral fence, the sun a heavy weight overhead, baking the sweat into Laura Bullion's hair and browning Nathan's arms a deeper shade of leather. She leaned against the rail and wiped her forehead with the hem of her apron, laughing breathlessly as Nathan dropped the hammer with a triumphant grunt. That there, he said, hands on his hips, surveying their work with satisfaction, might just be the finest crooked fence in all of Dakota Territory. Laura Bullion laughed, a real, spilling laugh, and he turned at the sound, that slow, rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It would have been easy to let it stay like that. Easy to drift into something comfortable, to build a life brick by brick without ever daring to name what pulsed between them. Easy but not true. Nathan, for all his silence, was not a man who shied from truth. The next morning he shaved clean, combed his hair back from his forehead, put on his best, if still well-worn, jacket, and saddled his horse with hands that shook more than they should have. He rode into town with the sun at his back and dust in his wake. At the general store, at the blacksmith's forge, at the steps of the church, men looked up from their work, tipping hats or raising eyebrows. Women paused in hanging laundry or drawing water, tongues already busy crafting the story before it had even begun. Nathan didn't care. He tethered his horse outside the small chapel and walked up the steps, boots striking hollow echoes against the wood. The door creaked open under his hand, and there, kneeling in the front pew, was Laura Bullion. She turned at the sound, surprise flickering across her face, then softening into something warmer when she saw him. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, heart hammering against his ribs like a bird desperate for flight. No grand speeches came. No pretty words or promises dusted with gold. Just Nathan Hale, a man who had lost too much and found something worth holding again, standing before her in the quiet hollow of that battered church. "I don't reckon I'm much of a prayer," he said, voice rough. "But I figure, if a man knows something good when he sees it, he ought to have the guts to hold on." Laura Bullion rose slowly, the hem of her simple dress brushing against the worn floorboards, the cross around her neck catching a shard of sunlight and setting it ablaze. Nathan stepped closer, heart in his throat. "I ain't offering much," he said. "Just a roof that leaks sometimes and fields that need mendin' more often than not. Just a man who'll stand with you when the sky turns dark and folks turn mean. A hand to carry the heavy things. A place you don't have to carry that cross alone." Laura Bullion's breath caught in her chest. She pressed her fingers lightly to the cross at her throat, feeling the familiar ridges, the worn metal warmed by her own skin. She saw it in his eyes, the fear, the hope, the raw, open need not to save her but to walk beside her. And in that moment she understood. Home was not a place. It was not safety offered on condition or love given for a price. It was standing before someone, battered and bowed, and finding that their arms were open anyway. Laura Bullion stepped forward, slow and sure. "You never saw it as a burden," she whispered. He shook his head. "Never." Her fingers closed over his, still rough from the rains, from the work, from living hard and honest. And when she smiled, small, trembling, fierce, it was like the whole tired, stubborn town bloomed around them, silent witness to something stronger than storms, stronger than spite, stronger than fear. Nathan drew her hand to his chest, pressing it there like a vow. Behind them, the chapel door creaked again, and they turned to see Mrs. Porter slipping in, her hands folded primly, her face crinkled in something very near a smile. And then Sadie Lynn, peeking shyly from behind the pews, clutching her brother's hand. And one by one others came, few but enough. A gathering of broken, stubborn souls who understood that sometimes you chose to stand, even when the world told you to turn away. The preacher dusted off his good book and cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he spoke the words that stitched their hearts together under the open rafters and the watching sky. There was no grand celebration, no feasting or fiddles. Just two souls choosing each other against all odds, against all fears, against every whisper and every sideways glance. Later, on the porch of their ranch house, their house now, Nathan carved a tiny cross above the doorframe with careful hands, the wood curling away in delicate shavings, a silent promise etched into the bones of their home. Not as a symbol of curse, but of carrying, of memory, of love that bore weight and found it light because it was carried together. Laura Bullion stood beside him, the silver cross still at her throat, but now it shone not as a burden or a brand, but as a beacon. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his hand over hers, steady and sure. The sky spread wide above them, endless and blue, and somewhere a meadowlark sang a song older than sorrow, older than shame. A song of things broken and mended. A song of things lost and found again. A song of beginnings. The prairie wind picked up, lifting the scent of wildflowers and fresh-turned earth, carrying it far and wide across the open land. And in that wind, if you listened closely, you could almost hear the world itself whisper. She was never lost. She was simply waiting for someone brave enough to find her.